Good afternoon. Uh, Welcome back again to the American Presidency lecture series. In this lecture, we will talk about the president and public opinion. This is the first of a two-part series on public opinion. In this first segment on public opinion, we will emphasize the important democratic factors associated with the president and public opinion. In particular, we'll look at democratic representation. We'll look at presidential difficulties in understanding public opinion. And then we'll also focus on whether presidents lead or follow public opinion near the latter part of this lecture. In the next session, in part two, we will focus on the president and public opinion as it pertains to public approval of the American president. There's a literal cottage industry, if you will, of studies on public approval of the president in political science. It's also used as an independent variable in many studies. And so let's go ahead and start the sharing of the screen. And as you can see, the lecture is entitled The President and Public Opinion, Part 1. Okay, so representation, power, and public opinion. This section focuses on the president as a representative entity, presidential power, and how both representation and power pertain to public opinion. First, from the standpoint of democratic theory, the president is really the only elected official in the United States who represents the public at large. The president is elected by the entire public, the voting age public. And so he representationally reflects or should reflect the public at large. Congress, viewed in macro, viewed as an entire entity, does, but the individual members of Congress do not represent the mass public, except in the sense that they have a duty as public persons to perform in a manner that reflects public values. The Supreme Court, of course, consists of non-elected officials. They are appointed and they represent the law rather than individuals or the mass public. So accordingly then, the president should reflect some overarching sense of public preferences. Well, we might ask, which public preferences? The preferences of the public at large, or the preferences of the electoral coalition that put them in office? These are important questions in democratic theory. These are questions that I attempted and did answer actually in my book entitled The Myth of Presidential Representation. Presidents also care about public opinion because of power concerns. A president who has strong public support, both for himself or herself, and also support for the issues, will be more successful in office. Public sentiment is very important to the president. It's a major source of influence for presidents, particularly the approval that they receive from those in the policy environment. Who's in the policy environment? Well, the policy environment includes the public at large, the policy community of elites, as well as the president's fellow partisans. Okay, so here's a conundrum. The president wants to please the public, or at least avoid irritating the public. The president also wants to lead the public. In fact, they are expected to be leaders. So you can see here that there's a reciprocal relationship. Presidents want to both please, which entails following the public, and they also want to lead the public. Those two things are not mutually exclusive, but it could be that sometimes it's difficult to do. There are things standing in the way of leading public opinion from the standpoint of the presidency. First, gauging public opinion is quite difficult. In order to know what public opinion is, you need to get past these obstacles. The public may not have clear views on many issues. So how are you supposed to know what public opinion is? The public is often ill-informed and may not even be able to tell you who the president and vice president are. The president is volatile. Often, the public rather is volatile, often being set off at symbolic gestures or issues. Polls may be inaccurate, biased by their methodology, and public sentiment can be soft. That is, it's readily changeable. So the public may say it's in favor of something, but it's not very much in favor of something, making it easy to flip on the issue. People around the president may tell the chief executive what he wants to hear rather than what he needs to hear. This was the case with Nixon, who surrounded himself with loyalists rather than professionals. He wanted people who would be consistent with his own views, and as a result of that, he ended up having problems in office. Donald Trump also, to a great extent, surrounded himself with people who were loyalists, who would agree with the president on every matter, and so they wouldn't tell the president what the public thinks. And so the president is in the limelight of American politics, with the media focusing in on every little detail. We talked about this last time, everything from the president's pets to the president's family, the president's health, major policy issues. Everything is in view through the lens of the mass media. The mass media is very important to public opinion. The media may not provide the sort of favorable treatment that the president wants. As a result, presidents may lose control of their message and of public opinion. The public has extremely high expectations of the president. Personally, their lives are expected to be conducted at a higher level than almost any individual citizen. They are expected to be all intelligent, prescient, that is, they can forecast the future, exhibiting strong personality, effective leaders, decisive, effective in public speaking, hard negotiators. It's not clear that any individual can meet up to the public's expectations on the presidency. And so there is a substantial gap between the presidential reality and the public's expectations of the president. This is often called the expectations gap in the literature on the American presidency. And you can read more about the expectations gap in your textbook as well as in your assigned readings. Part of the reason for the public's high expectations of the president lies in its lack of understanding of the context in which the presidency operates. The president is assumed to be all powerful. I mean, after all, he is ever present in the media landscape. And yet the presidency, in terms of formal powers, is probably our weakest institution. Most of the powers that the president has have come to the presidency through informal means, as we talked about earlier. And so the president must often persuade rather than command through formal powers. This is Richard Neustadt's famous phrase: the president must persuade. The presidential power is the power to persuade. There are contradictory expectations of the president, which makes it difficult for the president to be a democratic leader or a democratic follower. what is a leader? A leader is an independent figure who speaks out and takes stands on the issues. A leader should also be responsive to the electorate and the mass public. Note that this is sort of a no-win situation. It's difficult to be an independent figure while also being somebody who wiggles and woggles with regard to the mass public. If the president is too independent, then he or she can't be responsive. If the president is too responsive, then they are considered to be wafflers. Clinton was accused of being a waffler early on in his presidency, as he was more responsive to the mass public, kind of moving back and forth on issues and whatever the direction public opinion pulled him. Trump, on the other hand, was accused of acting on personal impulse, which implies that he was far too independent to be responsive to public opinion and the mass public. So from the Democratic point of view, there are problems for both someone like Clinton, who was a waffler, and Trump, who was acting very independently. The president is expected to be flexible and willing to compromise on the issues. He's also expected to be decisive and taking a firm stand, reflecting strong values and well-reasoned positions. Those are difficult mandates to reconcile. The president is expected to be a statesman who places the nation's interests ahead of particularistic interests. A particularistic interest meaning small interests or local interests. The president's also expected to be a skilled politician who can build coalitions and get things done. Presidents are expected to run open administrations with a free flow of ideas, and also keeping the details of government visible to the mass public. This implies no secrecy. The president should be in control of things, in other words. Evidence of internal dissent is seen as that the president is not in control of his administration. We want our president to keep us safe, yet we also want our president to respect civil liberties. Are these two things compatible? Can the president keep us safe, say, for example, from terror or from COVID-19, without conducting operations against those who would make us unsafe? Who decides who those people are that the operations would be conducted against? There's also a populist tendency to relate to the average person, that we want our president to relate to the average person. The president's expected to be an average Joe, somebody you could go sit down and have a beer with in a bar, or someone you could readily talk to. And yet citizens really don't want the president to be like them. He's held to a much higher standard. After all, the average citizen has lied. Who hasn't lied at least once in their lives? The average citizen has stolen something at least once in their lives. Many citizens have been unfaithful maritally. Many citizens have been divorced, seen a shrink at one time or another, have been drunk, sampled illegal drugs, but not inhaling, of course. So while we want our president to be above the fray, if you will, we want our president also to relate to the average citizen, but we really don't want the president to be like us. Many of us who have experienced a lot of those attributes that I just listed off. Great presidents are not followers of public opinion, they're leaders of it. Teddy Roosevelt said the following. He said, "People used to say of me that I divined what people were going to think." He said, "I don't divine. I simply make up my mind what they ought to think and then do my best to get them to think it." So that's one perspective on presidential leadership. And Teddy did a good job of leading public opinion in the early part of the 20th century. Presidents can offer several rationale for not following public sentiment. Nixon and Vietnam. Nixon had pledged during the 1972 election to get us out of Vietnam. And yet he didn't do so. We didn't leave Vietnam until 1975. Nixon's rationale for this, he claimed that there was a silent majority that was in support of his administration and his policies with regard to Vietnam. Or another example, preceding Nixon, Lyndon Johnson, civil rights and the poor, doing what's right rather than what's popular was Johnson's mantra here. Johnson realized and recognized that civil rights was not going to win him any votes. After all, a large part of the American public was opposed to civil rights at that time in American history. They were also opposed to welfare. And yet Johnson espoused the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and civil rights programs. He also espoused what was labeled his Great Society, which involved welfare programs to bring the poor out of poverty. And of course, this was not necessarily popular. He argued that it was right, though. Or Donald J. Trump's rationale for not following public opinion was, and I'm not quoting here, I am the greatest and all wise. So presidential goals are often to move public opinion. However, being reasonable suggests that they cannot move it too far. Moving public opinion provides a high test, maybe the biggest test of president's ability to lead. George Edwards, my colleague here at Texas A&M, recently retired, wrote a book entitled On Deaf Ears, and he makes a convincing case in that book that presidents cannot systematically move public opinion. In his book, he looks at presidential speeches and public opinion before and after presidential speeches, and the data that he presents shows that presidents don't move public opinion, or if they do move it, they don't move it very much, and the movements in public opinion are very short-lived. And so George makes a very convincing case that presidents can't systematically move public opinion. However, there are critical examples through history where presidents did move public opinion. In my book, The Myth of Presidential Representation, I discuss George Washington and the Jay Treaty. When the Jay Treaty was ratified, it was very unpopular. Ratified only because the Federalists held a large majority in Congress. The public was largely opposed to the Jay Treaty. However, the Jay Treaty needed funding, and that depended on the House of Representatives, which was in control of the other party, the Democratic Republicans. And so in order to get the Jay Treaty funded, it was unpopular, remember. What George did was he went on a tour in which he attempted to persuade the public. Of course, Washington was the hero of the American Revolution and a very popular figure. And when people heard that he was very much in favor of the Jay Treaty, they threw their support behind the Jay Treaty. So Washington, in the early days of the Republic, also moved public opinion in the favor of the Jay Treaty. Another example that comes out in one of my books, the book entitled Presidential Saber Rattling. John Adams moved public opinion in the efforts toward the so-called quasi-war with France. The war was not very popular initially, and before Adams was done, there was a call for us to declare war on France. No declaration of war was ever made, and so we conducted a quasi-war with France, and it was very popular. Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal is an obvious example. A more recent example of moving public opinion was George W. Bush and the Iraq invasion. Prior to the invasion, the public was very opposed to invading Iraq. In the few months leading up to the invasion, Bush pulled a hat trick, if you will, and convinced the public that the war on Iraq was justified. Of course, we all know, if you're old enough, we all know that soon after the Iraq invasion, public opinion turned in the other direction as the justification for the war, weapons of mass destruction, was disproved. And so in the end, George W. Bush suffered by moving public opinion in the direction of favoring the war. Presidents then who lead move public opinion to their own perspective. Presidents who facilitate simply channel already existing public opinion into their policy initiatives. And so leadership moves public opinion to what the president wants, but presidents are sometimes in the position to simply channel already existing public opinion into their policy initiatives. The public may already be supportive, and these are called facilitators. So we have leader presidents and facilitator presidents who already have favorable public opinion. So that's a categorization actually that was proposed initially by George Edwards. Understanding public opinion. In order to effectively use public opinion to their advantage, then presidents have to know what public sentiment is. However, citizens generally don't have clear and coherent views on most issues. Indeed, the details of policy are things that they don't have the foggiest about. It requires a lot of effort to become informed on the issues. Citizens lack the time, the expertise, and the inclination to do so. In regard to time, citizens have 9-to-5 jobs. They don't have time to make themselves informed on the most technical of issues. They also lack the education and the expertise to do so for the most part. Finally, they really don't care a lot about a lot of the issues, and so they lack the time, expertise, and motivation to develop clear and crystallized views on most issues. Citizens have preferences only over the general contours of issues and governmental activities. There is a mean and a variance that exists for particular issues. However, citizen preferences also involve aggregations of issues. People operate more at the symbolic level than at a rational level on issues and policy. Question wording can matter. People want a balanced budget, but they also want all of the programs currently in the federal budget. People want lower taxes, but they want no reduction in government programs, especially if those government programs affect them. They want an end to big government, but they also want all of the benefits that government currently offers and more. Citizens hate the bureaucracy, but if you ask those who have dealt with the bureaucracy about the quality of their relations, they are overwhelmingly approving of their interactions with the bureaucracy. Jim Stimson claims that citizens have only a nebulous or doubtful sense of liberalism and conservatism on the issues. Collective public opinion, he argues, has different properties than opinions at any one time of the collectivity. He argues that changes occur only at the margins in public opinion. He developed a measure called public mood. Public mood is the relative liberalism and conservatism of the public on the issues at any one point in time. Notice I've got a graph here in front of you. The graph is Stimson's measure of public mood. How did he construct this graph? Well, he took every single survey at each one of the data points here. So here we have 1953 rather. And he took the data in every single public opinion survey that existed at that time. And the questions in the surveys can be categorized as to whether there's a liberal and conservative dimension on those questions. So he took those questions and he used an algorithm to aggregate the responses on the opinion surveys to construct a measure of mood. And so you can see here in 1952 rather, mood was below 50. It's at the most negative point, most conservative point as it was in all of the history of the time series. Note that by 1960, it had climbed significantly. And by 61 and 62, it was at a localized peak. Who was president at this time? Well, you're right, it was John Kennedy. But note what happened after the Kennedy assassination and Lyndon Johnson became president. You can see that Johnson benefited briefly with the liberalism in public mood, but almost immediately after his presidency started, mood turned into a negative direction, into a conservative direction. And so that by 1968, it was at a localized minimum. Who was elected in 1968? Well, it was Richard Nixon. But perniciously enough, immediately after Nixon was elected, mood turned liberal and remained liberal until around 1973, and then turned conservative again. Notice that during Carter, mood became increasingly conservative until 1980. In 1980, who was elected? Well, it was Ronald Reagan. But perniciously for the president, liberalism turned more liberal again, reaching a localized peak in liberalism about the time of the George H.W. Bush administration. It remained liberal throughout the George H.W. Bush administration and turned conservative. Clinton was elected in 1993, about right here, and then during Clinton, mood turned increasingly conservative. During Clinton, it became liberal later, and then continued its liberalism climb through the George W. Bush administration, and then reversed course during the Obama administration. And finally, note that you reach a localized minimum in liberalism around 2016 or so. And then we're currently at a peak in liberalism for the entire period. So two things you should observe from this graph. At peaks of liberalism, we elect liberal presidents. Almost immediately after the election of a liberal president, we see mood or liberalism, conservatism turn in a negative direction. Similarly, when we elect Republican presidents, as in 1968, 1980, and 2000, we see liberalism turn in a liberal direction. Another thing, a second thing you should note from this graph is you can make a forecast using this graph of what's going to happen relative to the Biden administration. What would you predict relative to the Biden administration? Well, we would predict that liberalism will turn more in the conservative direction during the Biden administration. So Stimson's measure of public mood is quite useful in helping us to understand mass public opinion, or public opinion considered in the aggregate. Okay, so how do we measure public opinion? Opinion polls is the most common tool for measuring public opinion. Who conducts opinion polls? Well, we have the Gallup organization. We'll look a lot at the Gallup organization in the next part of this lecture series when we look at public approval. The Roper organization, CBS, New York Times, NBC, Wall Street Journal, Fox News, and so forth. Presidents have used pollsters since Franklin Roosevelt. Presidents, however, typically don't have exclusive use of pollsters. It's too expensive. Public opinion polls are very expensive to conduct. Nevertheless, presidents sometimes hire outside firms and pollsters. This was the case during the Reagan administration, as well as in Congress relative to certain policies of the Reagan administration. A major repository, a major resource for obtaining public opinion data is the Roper Center. Texas A&M University owns a subscription to this service. What the Roper Center does, it serves as a repository for polling organizations. Because we have a subscription to the Roper Center data source, it's freely available to all faculty, staff, and students. It's free to you. All you have to do is just register. And here's a hot link that takes you to the Roper Center. We're going to click that shortly, and you'll see how it works. Let's do it now. Okay, so we have now entered the Roper Center. Notice that I am logged in. I believe I'm logged in. Let me move this over a little bit. Yeah, I should be logged in. Yeah, I'm logged in. So I have established an account with the Roper Center. The account is free by virtue of our status as a member of the Roper Center. And using the Roper Center, you can do a search on keywords and any topic you want. You select the period of time that you want the keywords to be pertain to. So let's just do a quick search here. Let's do Biden and the and is Boolean, as in Boolean algebra. Biden and what? Let's do Biden and ethics. And we'll do our start for January 1st and the end for August 10th. And we'll search the Roper poll. Okay, so what did we find here? We found one question in all of this time, a survey by the Pew Research Center conducted by the Ipsos organization. Let's go to the result here. Okay, so the question was, with Joe Biden as president, do you think the overall level of ethics and honesty in the federal government will rise, fall, or stay the same? Let's look at the bar chart for this. This is called the top line. 46% of respondents thought that the overall level of ethics and honesty would rise during the Biden administration. 30% thought it would fall, and 24% said it would stay the same. 1% said no answer. And so what we can do with this, we can copy this to an image and then download the image to our personal computer and then use those data in our research. And so that's an example of using the Roper Center. The possibilities of research through the Roper Center using public opinion data are quite endless. I've used it to a great extent in my own work. And you can also download the actual data for many of the polls that are taken in the Roper Center repository and use the actual data in your research projects. Okay, so polls have their problems though, potential problems. Public opinion can be nebulous or doubtful, and it can also be volatile on some issues. When citizens don't have strong views, it's possible to get a lot of variability in responses on polls. Another problem, polls don't always measure what the president wants to know. You can see questions where the respondents are asked to agree or disagree with a statement or answer yes or no to a statement. These kinds of questions tell us little about the details of policy and the nuances of the issues that the president wants to know about. So they're not all that informative to the president. Also, responses may reflect the wording of questions. If you ask about welfare, as in welfare programs, you're likely to get a different response than if you ask about the poor, the homeless, and the needy. People are overwhelmingly opposed to welfare, but also overwhelmingly humanitarian in their desire to help the poor and the homeless. Also, polls are not taken in a timely fashion. That is when presidents need the data, because independent polling organizations work on their own time schedule. They don't serve the president, they serve their donors, and they get the polling data when they need the polling data, not when the president needs the polling data. However, public opinion can be dynamic. In other words, at the time a poll is taken, opinion can be in one direction, but then later be in another direction, so that the president may get faulty information from polls taken at one point in time that's not the point in time that the president is interested in. Presidents sometimes use election results to gauge public opinion. In fact, presidents often attempt to claim a mandate based on the presidential election, and yet elections are what? They are aggregations of preferences, and they don't constitute mandates on particular issues. There are some problems, as with polls, of using election results. Voters may approve of the candidates, but not have opinions on particular issues or policies. Also, in voting, symbols are important, as well as party ID. And so voters may approve of candidates based on their party ID, but have different opinions on particular issues or policies. Also, voters may not know the candidate's stance on the issues. Candidates have an incentive to not be clear on the issues and the policies that they support, and this will be consistent with what we refer to as the Downsian model. I'll talk about the Downsian model in later materials. The election reflects the views of only part of the electorate, those who turned out first, and those who voted for the candidate second. Does the elected have an obligation to represent all or only the winning coalition? And that is the question in democratic theory that I addressed in my book, The Myth of Presidential Representation. The president may not know what the public's views are even after an election. What does the election mean? Reagan in 1980 claimed that citizens were favorable to the message of reducing big government and getting the government off the backs of states and citizens. However, polling data suggests that people voted for Reagan in 1980 mainly because he was not Jimmy Carter. They were also not favorable toward reducing environmental protection or equal employment opportunity or consumer protection or antitrust regulation, all areas of government that Reagan attempted to curtail. So in this case, Reagan misperceived what the meaning of the election was. And as a result, he was unsuccessful in reducing the size of government and diminishing government regulation. Indeed, by the end of the Reagan administration, government was much larger than it had been at the start, and government regulation continued without change at the end of the Reagan administration. So election results are a rather tenuous way to gauge public opinion. Another way presidents attempt to gauge public opinion is by looking at mail from the public. Of course, the White House receives several million pieces of mail every year, including email. Astoundingly, all mail that the White House receives is answered by someone. The White House staff typically will prepare a synopsis of public views for the president using the mail. But wait a minute, is the mail a random sample? No. It's skewed toward activists. It's skewed toward those who have very intense and strong feelings on the issues, either for or against an issue. Nevertheless, the White House is very responsive to mail. And we're going to go to the White House here at this hot link that I've got. And you can see from this hot link that the White House maintains a form that you can use to type your message. So let's look here. You want to contact the president, contact the vice president, get help with a federal agency, or question about the White House website. Your prefix, I would put doctor, you would put Mr. Your name, your email address, your phone number, your regular address, and then finally, in this box, you would put what you like to say. And once you're finished, then you would click send, and you would expect a response pretty soon after the mail is sent, based on the White House's staff that is responsible for answering your email. Occasionally, and very rarely occasionally, you'll get a direct response from the president. And these tend to be highlighted in the news when the president makes a direct response to mail. So presidents have a lot of trouble understanding public opinion. Even if they could understand public opinion, it's not clear what it means because it can be extremely changeable, volatile. Do presidents follow public opinion? Let's look at some data using the Roper Center's iPoll resource, the one we just looked at a few minutes ago, for 2 recent presidents. We'll look at some data, poll data on Trump, and we'll look at some poll data on Biden. Even though we're looking at 2 recent presidents, note that these data can stretch back into the 1930s. And so there are big possibilities for political science research going all the way back to Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt, and continuing through every president all the way up through Joe Biden. First, let's look at some polling data for Donald J. Trump. Note before we do this that he was not a follower of public opinion. He attempted to lead public opinion, and he was a follower of public opinion in the sense that he followed Fox News, or what he thought was the approach of those who voted for him. He was though not a follower of mass public opinion. Let's look at some data here. Okay, here's the results from a question that was repositoried in the Roper Center. The poll organization was the Monmouth University poll in March of 2017. Note this is just a couple of months after Trump was elected to the presidency. You may or may not recall that the 2016 2016 election. One of the big issues in 2016 was what would happen to the Affordable Care Act. And so the question reads, what would you like to see with regards to the Affordable Care Act? They should keep the law as it is. They should keep the law in place and work to improve it. They should repeal the law and replace it with an alternative. They should repeal the law and not replace it. Okay, so what was the result here? 7% said keep the law just as it is without change. And that actually is what happened. 51% said keep the law and work to improve it. This is what happened later. 31% said repeal the law and replace it. So what do we got here? We've got 58% wanted to keep the law, with the great majority wanting to improve the law. Another 31%, for a total of 89%, wanted to have some form of health care protection, because the 31% wanted to repeal the law and replace it with something else. So the great majority was in favor of some sort of affordable health care for average Americans. Was this consistent with what Trump wanted? Trump promised during the 2016 campaign to be a strong advocate for repealing the Affordable Care Act and actually not replacing it. And so you can see here he was not following public opinion. Public opinion was in favor of keeping the Affordable Care Act and or alternatively replacing it with something else. Okay, here's another question. Thinking about some of the specific actions Donald Trump has taken since he has been in office, would you say you approve or disapprove of each of the following? How about ordering the construction of a wall along the southern border? This was a Gallup poll taken in January of 2017. Now we have 60% disapprove of Trump's policy of building a wall along the southern border. Only 38% approved of that policy. So a large majority of Americans were opposed to the wall along the southern border. Was Trump a follower of public opinion, or did he attempt to lead public opinion? Well, he certainly was not a follower of mass public opinion. He may have been a follower of his fellow partisans on this issue, but clearly the construction of the wall was not consistent with the larger body of public opinion in America. Okay, one more question for Trump. Thinking about some of the specific actions Donald Trump has taken since he has been in office, would you say you approve or disapprove of each of the following? How about ordering a temporary ban on entry into the U.S. for most people from 7 predominantly Muslim countries? This is again a Gallup poll taken in January of 2017. This is shortly after Trump took office. You can see that 55% disapproved of the policy of ordering a ban on people entering the United States from Muslim countries. Only 42% approved of that policy. Was Trump a leader or a follower of public opinion? He attempted to lead public opinion, but he certainly didn't follow mass public opinion. He probably followed his fellow partisans on these issues. So that's some data on Trump and following public opinion. Let's look at Biden. Okay, so the question reads, do you approve or disapprove of the way Biden is handling the response to the coronavirus? And note that 63% approve of Biden's response on coronavirus. Is Biden leading or following public approval? I think it's some of both here. Biden's handling of coronavirus leads to the public approving. Also, public approving reinforces Joe Biden's approach to handling the coronavirus. He can be quick to change if public opinion turns in the opposite direction for one of his policies. Another question for Biden. President Biden proposed other multi-trillion-dollar spending plans, an infrastructure plan to be spent on roads, bridges, and trains, internet access, power grid improvements, and clean energy projects. In general, do you support or oppose this plan? Is that strongly or somewhat support oppose? So those who strongly support Biden's infrastructure plan is 51%. Somewhat support is another, somewhat support, another 19%, somewhat opposed, 8%, strongly opposed, 21%. So you can see that a strong majority supported Biden's approach to repairing our sagging infrastructure in the United States. A total of about 70% were supportive of Biden's infrastructure package. Okay, one more question. Let's give equal treatment to Biden. Now, for each of the following, please tell me if you approve or disapprove of President Biden's handling of each item. Border security and immigration. Okay, you can see from this graph that 59% disapprove of his handling of border security and immigration. Only 33% approve of the policy. So he's not following public opinion on this issue. In fact, he's diametrically opposed to public opinion on his approach to border security. This is a poll conducted in April of this year. Okay, so let's stop sharing and summarize and introduce the next lecture. In this lecture, we've talked about the president as a Democratic leader. As a Democratic leader, the president is expected to both be responsive to public opinion and also to lead public opinion. We all expect the president to be a leader, and also we expect him to be responsive to us. Doing both can be a difficult task for the president, and hence the president has a conundrum. As a Democratic leader, do I follow the public or do I try to lead the public? And that will determine the president's approach to dealing with public opinion. Whatever approach the president uses in dealing with public opinion, the president is in the position of having a hard time understanding public opinion. We gave a lot of reasons why it's difficult to understand public opinion, from the public's volatility, the public's unclear and incoherent views, the changeability of public opinion, and so forth. And so it's difficult for the president to grasp what is on the public's mind for a whole lot of reasons that we talked about in this lecture. We also talked about public mood, which is a very important measure of public opinion at the aggregate level. That measure enables us to try to understand the relative liberalism and conservatism of the mass public, not on specific issues, but just relatively how does the public feel in terms of their mood on conservatism and liberalism. We've also talked about whether or not the president is responsive to public opinion, looking at 3 examples each from Donald Trump and then also from Joe Biden using the Roper Center data. I introduced you to the Roper Center partially because it's relevant to this lecture. Secondly, though, because it's a resource that you can use as a student here at Texas A&M that enables you to track public opinion. How does the public feel about what the president is doing? Many times you can do a search on recent public opinion and find out exactly what you need to know about the president. And maybe just for your own purposes, or you may be doing a research project in another class. And so that's what we've done in this lecture. In the next lecture, part 2 of our series on public opinion, we will talk about the president's public approval ratings, why we should care about the president's public approval ratings. We'll also talk about how one goes about measuring public approval. And then we'll look at the ratings for all presidents, since public approval has been reported since the 1940s. And then we'll look at some specifics on public approval as it pertains to recent presidents. Okay, so with that, we will cease this lecture and stop recording and join you in a couple of days for the next part of this lecture series.